4.25 million. That was the number Charlie Javice put in front of JPMorgan Chase. 4.25 million students, she said, had used her financial aid startup. According to the Justice Department, JPMorgan believed it, and in 2021 the bank paid $175 million to buy the company. The real number of users was under 300,000. This was not a rounding error or a bad quarter. Frank's customer base existed almost entirely inside a spreadsheet that did not describe real people. This is the story of how that spreadsheet got made, how it closed a deal, and how it eventually put its creator in a federal prison for 7 years. The company was called Frank. The pitch was simple and genuinely useful. Applying for federal student aid means filling out a form called the FAFSA, and that form is famously confusing. Frank offered to make it easier. Get in, answer the questions, get your aid. Javice founded Frank and ran it as chief executive. She was young, she was fluent in the language of Silicon Valley growth, and she had a story that sold. The problem was never the idea. Plenty of people did want help with the FAFSA. The problem was the size of the audience Frank claimed to have reached, because that audience was the entire asset JPMorgan thought it was buying. Here is why the user count mattered so much. JPMorgan was not buying Frank's software. It was buying access to millions of young people at the exact moment they start making financial decisions. A college freshman opening a first checking account is worth a lot to a bank over a lifetime. So the value of the deal rested almost entirely on one figure: how many real students Frank could actually deliver. 4.25 million made Frank look like a direct line to a generation. 300,000 made it a small business with a nice product. The Justice Department says Javice knew the difference and represented the larger number anyway. During due diligence, JPMorgan did what any careful buyer does. It asked Javice to prove the number. Show us the users. That request is the hinge of the whole case. A real company answers it by exporting its real customer list. According to the Justice Department, Frank could not do that because the list did not exist at anything close to the size promised. So instead of walking back the number, Javice and her co-defendant, Olivier Amar, decided to manufacture the proof. They set out to build a customer list that would pass the bank's checks, one that looked like 4.25 million real people and was nothing of the kind. To do it, prosecutors say they hired an outside data scientist and asked this person to generate a synthetic data set. In plain terms, that means using a computer to invent names, addresses, and other details and stitch them together so the fakes look statistically like a real customer base. The result was a fabricated file, padded out to the size the deal required. It was fiction dressed up as a database, and it was handed to JPMorgan as if it were the genuine record of Frank's users, 4 million people who had never signed up for anything. The synthetic file did its job. The deal closed in 2021 and the money changed hands. But a fabricated customer list is a liability that only grows. JPMorgan now believed it owned more than 4 million student relationships, and a bank buys those relationships in order to use them. Every future step depends on the list being real. Reaching those customers, marketing to them, measuring them, all of it assumes the names belong to living people. A database of invented users can survive a document review. It cannot survive contact with the real world. The gap between 4.25 million and 300,000 was still sitting there, and it was not the kind of gap that stays buried. So, according to the Justice Department, they tried to close the gap after the fact. Once the deal had already closed, they spent about $105,000 to buy an actual list of student data from a third-party source. Consider the logic of that purchase. The company had just sold for $175 million on the strength of more than 4 million users. Now, after the sale, roughly $100,000 went to a third-party source for a bulk list of student data, an attempt to backfill customers that had been promised but never existed. It was an attempt to make the misrepresentation retroactively smaller. But you cannot buy your way back to 4 million real customers for $100,000, and that purchase closed almost none of the gap. What it did was leave a trail. There was now a record of a company that knew its true numbers and had gone shopping for replacements. The matter drew federal scrutiny, and prosecutors in the Southern District of New York charged Javice and Amar together. The government's theory was straightforward. Javice had told a bank her company had 4.25 million users when it had fewer than 300,000, and she had manufactured evidence to prove a number that was never true. The counts were serious: conspiracy, wire fraud, bank fraud, and securities fraud. These are the charges the government brings when it says someone lied to a financial institution to move money. The case went to trial, and it was not a quick one. According to the Justice Department, the trial ran 6 weeks. Jurors heard the story of the synthetic data set, the outside data scientist, and the after-the-fact purchase of real student records. In March 2025, the jury reached its verdict. Javice was convicted on every count. Amar, her co-defendant, was convicted of the same counts. Sentencing came on September 29, 2025. United States District Judge Alvin K. Hellerstein handed Charlie Javice 85 months in prison. That is just over 7 years. For a first-time defendant in a white-collar case, it is a heavy term, and it reflects how the court weighed a fraud that targeted a bank for a 9-figure sum. The Justice Department framed the case exactly that way in its own headline, calling it a $175 million fraud. The number that started as a growth metric on a pitch deck had become the measure of a federal crime, and the sentence attached to it. The money side of the judgment is just as striking. The court ordered Javice to forfeit $22,360,977.48. That is the profit the government moved to claw back. On top of that came restitution of $287,501,078 ordered jointly and severally with Amar. Jointly and severally means each of them can be held responsible for the full amount, not just their share. So the restitution figure runs well past the $175 million purchase price, because it accounts for the wider damage the fraud caused, not only the sticker price of the deal. Step back and the mechanics are almost mundane. There was no exotic financial instrument here. The core of the scheme was a claim about a number of users, a number that a computer program generated on demand, sold to a bank for $175 million. The lesson for anyone on the buying side is uncomfortable. Frank's 4.25 million customers were, in principle, checkable. The proof was fabricated, and it still made it far enough to close a 9-figure acquisition. The document that finally settled the story was the sentencing order, and it put the founder of Frank in prison for 85 months.